All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of interviews that I hope to do here on the channel about the mechanism of dice placement. So I really want to kind of dig in to a single mechanism and explore it by interviewing, well-known established designers who have designed games with this mechanism and kind of learn the ins and outs of, of what can make a good dice placement game in case you are thinking about designing a dice placement game of your own, which I am, or if you're just a fan of that kind of game and you just want to learn kind of behind the scenes and a little bit more about that type of mechanism. So today I'm really excited to have Jamey Stegmaier, who is the lead designer over at Stonemaier Games, among a bunch of other roles that he has there. And of course, if you don't know, you might know Stonemaier Games for a lot of the great games that they produce. Some of the favorites we have in this household are like Viticulture and Wingspan. And then, of course, Scythe, Red Rising, lots of great games. And we'll have a link below this video to his website so you can check out all the games that they've produced over there. But today we're going to actually be digging into Euphoria, which is the game that Jamey designed way back in the day. That has some excellent dice placement mechanisms in it. So welcome to the show, Jamey. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that nice introduction. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to have you. Thank you for putting aside some time to dig into this particular mechanism that I'm a big fan of and I'm working on a game on. And so I'd love to, before we get started, kind of maybe get your thoughts on when we say dice placement, and when you think of dice placement, what does that mean to you? What is the definition of that?
To me, I'd almost break it down into two categories. There's dice as workers, and there's dice insertion. So dice as workers are, to me, like when you're using the die, whether or not you're rolling it. Sometimes you're just manipulating the die, using the die to track information. But for some reason, you're placing a die either on a common shared space, that would be worker placement, where you're kind of taking a space that someone else can't take, or they have to bump your die out of the way, or you're placing it like in Fantastic Factories, you're inserting it onto your player mat or one of the cards that you have. Gotcha. And then there's dice insertion, which it's a little bit askew of this category, but that's in the style of like Sagrada. I think Sagrada is kind of a modern classic insertion game where you're selecting a die, you're drafting a die and inserting it into a specific place, and that means something for what you're building based on how you're inserting it. Role Player is another kind of game with a very different thing where you're inserting dice into a place. So the placement of the dice matters both ways, but does very different things. Does that cover it from your perspective? What do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think about the dice insertion aspect of it, and that's right. And there is kind of a separation there where you're thinking about dice placement as maybe a worker placement type of mechanism in the traditional sense, like you said, where you're having shared spaces that you're competing for. And then, the dice kind of add an extra, value to that, which is interesting, or randomness to that, where you, but then, the dice insertion is something I didn't even think that was like kind of in that same vein where you are placing dice, but you're using that to kind of build something else that's not necessarily using them as a worker. So that's an interesting distinction that I think is a cool distinction to think about.
Where does your game fall in right now, where the game is right now? Is it more of that play, you're selecting something with the die, or you're accumulating dice and inserting them, or they have some other meaning once you actually have them?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting kind of combination of both. So in my game, it's about starting a band. And so the musicians are represented by a die. And in the first part of the game, you're placing them on a board to do certain things to prepare for like the live gig that you're going to play. And then in the second half of the game, you're rolling the dice and placing them on your musicians in spots that are available on your musicians to show like they're playing a live gig and how their performance goes and if they're successful or not and that kind of thing. So it's kind of a little bit of both, I think. And I've had fun exploring kind of the different ways you can roll dice and mitigate them and place them in various ways.
That's cool. That's cool that you have both of those elements in the game.
Yeah. So, what do you? It sounds like you're a fan of this type of mechanism. What do you like best, or what do you think people in general like best about this mechanism?
Well, I think there's something in most gamers that we enjoy the act of rolling dice. There's something nice about it. One of my most recent game, Rolling Realms, includes 2 dice, and it's really just nice to roll those 2 dice and see what happens. But I
Right.
think the modern dice placement and dice insertion games, the the reason I think they are fairly popular is that the, you get to have this random element of rolling the dice, but there's also a lot of agency in what you actually do with those dice. It's not you're not dealing with a random outcome. Often you have these dice and you're either placing them knowing what's on the dice and you're placing them somewhere. So you have a lot of agency into where you place them, and you know what the number means based on where you're placing it. Or if you're inserting it, you have agency as to which die you select in Sagrada or role player games like that, and choosing where you want to insert it as well. So it's almost, to me, it really clicks with me as a gamer because I like games with a lot of agency, but a little bit of variability and luck. And
Right.
dice just capture that really, really well.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it at the beginning where there's just something about the physical rolling of the dice that
Mhm.
can't be captured in other randomizers that are out there. It's just kind of a fun, you know, physical thing that people like. I like for sure.
Yeah. There's
Cool.
I don't know if you've experienced this during the pandemic, but a die game that I love is Dice Forge. Have you played Dice Forge?
Yeah,
Yeah. And Dice
yeah, that's
Forge, it's a wonderful game where you get to roll these dice a lot. You roll the dice a lot through the game. But there's also, and during the pandemic, I haven't been able to play that game in person as much, but it is available on Board Game Arena.
mm,
And it's like I like playing the game on there, but I miss the act of tactily rolling the dice when I'm
yeah.
on Board Game Arena. So it's one of those components that it really feels good when you're playing the game in person on the table.
And am I thinking right? Is that the one where you take off, like you can change
Yeah,
out the dice faces? Yeah, yeah, and
yeah,
that's just fun on its own too. Like you can
right,
craft
yeah,
your own die, and then you're rolling it and getting these results. So yeah, I completely agree that you get the fun kind of unpredictability of rolling dice, but then you have agency over what you do with it, and that feels
yeah,
good too. So it's kind of the two sides of the spectrum there.
yeah,
Okay, well let's dig in a little bit to then the dice placement game that you designed, which is Euphoria.
yeah.
And I know it's been a while since you designed that, but if you can just, for folks who aren't too familiar with the game, just kind of give a brief description of what Euphoria is and when it came out and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Euphoria is a dice as workers. The dice represent your workers in Euphoria. It's a dystopian themed game where you're essentially managing a little piece of this dystopia and telling your workers where to go to work your way up through the dystopia a little bit. And the dice in particular in this game um, matter quite a bit in terms of where you place them. The numbers might matter. Like there's these areas called like commodity areas, and you might place a die there, and you look at the total sum of all dice that are in that area, and that determines what how much you'll get from that area. And I tried to tie it to the theme of dystopias, specifically with that mechanism, and a few other times in the game, in terms of the pips on the dice representing your worker knowledge. Because in a dystopia, you don't want your workers to be smart enough to realize that they are in a dystopia. You want them to kind of go about their business and stay ignorant as they're doing so.
Yep.
And so I tried to play with that a lot with the knowledge element of the game, and it that finding that part of the theme made it a lot of fun to work with dice in the game.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a cool spin on the genre in that game. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, what made you want to focus on kind of dice and dice placement in that game? Was it something you were a fan of? Is it a mechanism you wanted to explore? What was kind of the genesis of that?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of a few different things. One was I had played, what was the game that I played? I always forget the name of this game, even though I love it. Alien Frontiers. I played
Oh
Alien
yeah.
Frontiers
Hmm.
around that time when I was working on the design. I was like, oh, this is really cool. I love what Alien Frontiers does with dice. That's very much a dice placement game. Have you played that? I haven't played it in a while, but I do love the game.
Yeah, I haven't played it, but I watched a playthrough video of it
Mhm.
recently because I've been trying to find all the dice placement games and just learn how they work. So that's kind of one of
Yeah,
the original kind of dice
yeah.
placement games, and it's very simple but streamlined and looks like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's a good game, and I think there's a pretty good. The version I used to play was on my iPad. I haven't played that in a
Oh,
while, but there's a pretty good app driven version of it. So it's partially that I'd played that game, and originally uh, I had this idea of knowledge, using knowledge, and I wanted a way to track it. And so originally the dice were just used as tracking tools for that knowledge. Like you
mm,
would, whenever you placed a worker, you would increase the knowledge for that die by 1 pip. And so it was just like a tracking thing, a tracking component. But I realized fairly early on in the design that, and this has kind of become a design philosophy of mine whenever I use dice, that part of the fun of dice, like we've already talked about, is actually rolling those dice. And so
Right.
if you're just using them as a tracking tool, oh, that is clever. There's some games that do that. That's fine. But I think it's a lot more fun if you actually get to roll those dice. And playtesters kept pointing that out. And I kept realizing it while I was playing. I was like, I had these dice. It's fine that I'm moving them around to get different pips on them, but I really just want to roll them. And so once that happened, I kind of really embraced that in the design, that these dice were meant to be rolled at some point in the game.
Nice. What were some of the challenges? And I know it's been a while since you designed it, but if you could think back to when you were working on the design of that game, what were some of the challenges that you remember, having to overcome, and what did you do to overcome them as far as the dice placement is concerned in that game?
I don't know if this is specific to the dice, but it is related to the dice. It's more of a worker placement thing, but there are a lot of actions on the board in Euphoria, but I've often found that playtesters wanted to take the same action that someone else had taken. And so I implemented this bumping mechanism where if your die is on the board and I want to go there, for most of the spots on the board, I can place my die there and bump that die back to you. And I wanted that to have meaning in the game, because otherwise it makes worker placement itself somewhat irrelevant if you can always just bump someone else's worker. And so I basically made Euphoria a game where there aren't rounds in the game. Like, you aren't all players aren't placing workers and then at the end of the round you retrieve those workers. Rather, you are either taking a die placement turn, or you are retrieving any or all of your dice. I think this was influenced by Tzolk'in. Tzolk'in had just come out, and
Oh,
I was
interesting.
playing that at the time. Not a dice game, but a game where you have that place or retrieve thing.
Right.
Uh, and I really liked that. That's when I really started to embrace the flow of the game, removing rounds, which has become a kind of a core philosophy of Stonemaier games as well, for most of our games, where you on your turn, you were just doing one thing or the other, and then it's the next player's turn. And you never interrupt the game. You never disrupt the game to have a round. And the bumping
Right.
mechanism became a big part of that. Yeah. Yeah. I would say
Cool.
that's one thing that comes to mind.
Right. So along those same lines, if those who are watching are interested in creating their own kind of dice placement game, what do you think is something that they should be keeping in mind as they're designing it to make it fun and interesting for the players?
Well, yeah, two things come to mind real quick, and there's many things here. I'm curious about your thoughts as well. One is, if you are using numerical dice, like a D6, numbered 1 through 6, that you give meaning to low rolls just as you give meaning to high rolls. So high rolls aren't just inherently better; that there are times in the game where low rolls are better, maybe even much better than a high roll in the game. I think that's important to keep in mind. I try to keep that in mind with Euphoria. And the other thing is that it's okay not to use standard D6 dice or standard
Ah,
numerical dice. That you can use dice with different numbers. You can put any number you want on a die. You can put custom icons on it. And custom icons, I found, I love custom dice. I think
mm,
gamers maybe love custom dice, but I really, really love them. And so to if you're thinking about a dice-driven game, to give yourself permission to try out some other things to put on those dice, because that can be a lot of fun too. It can make playtesting more difficult, but
true.
it is to have to hold, custom. Do you have a favorite custom die that comes to mind, or a game that where you really like the custom dice in it, whether it's numerical or icons?
I mean, Roll for the Galaxy comes to mind, I
Yeah.
think, as
Hmm.
one, and uh, Dice Forge is another
Dice
one
Forge.
that,
Yeah.
of course, has custom faces that are very cool. Yeah, I think there's a lot of room to just experiment, right, with what you put
Yeah.
on the dice or how you use the dice. I think something that I like to see, what I like about designing a dice placement game, is really trying to figure out how to use the numbers in interesting ways in the
Hmm.
placement. So you
Yeah.
can, you have in your game, it's like a group of dice reach a certain threshold, and then it bumps
Yeah.
to the next kind of commodity you can earn. And then you can have place dice, so they have to be in a straight, or they have to
Hmm.
be all the same number, or it has
Yeah.
to be a certain number. Something in my game is we have dice colors that come into play, so there are three different types of
Hmm.
colors that can trigger interesting bonuses if you put them in certain places. But to really have fun with the values, and then the type of dice you use, and try to configure those in interesting ways on the board, I think is what really makes that part of the game fun. And then every round, or every time you roll them, you have a new configuration of dice that you have to figure out how
Hmm.
to puzzle together on the board. I think that's a lot
Yeah.
of fun.
Yeah. I like the little mini games that can emerge from that. Like you just mentioned, like
Yeah.
putting dice in a straight, or using poker hand type things, trying to get a 3 of a kind, 4 of a kind, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So what do you think that so with dice, especially if you're using just a standard D6, you have numbers 1 through 6, and
Yeah.
someone could end up rolling sixes over and over and over again. It's possible. Someone could end up rolling ones over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So do you think that introduces some type of imbalance inherent in dice rolling games, and then also dice placement games?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think we've seen some designers look at games that have dice. Like I think Settlers of Catan. There's a version of
Mm,
Settlers that just has a deck of cards with the numbers
right.
um, that you can play with. Because with a deck of cards, you know that eventually you're going to hit that 12. Like the 12 is going to come out at some point. Whereas when you're rolling the dice, the 12 you might roll it a bunch of times somehow in a game, unlikely, but it could happen, or you might never roll it. Um, I think that, and I think for that reason, like sometimes I see people, like I'll post a video about dice, and inevitably every now and then I'll see someone post a comment, and all they say is, "Oh, it has dice. I'm not interested at all," because I
Mm,
think they associate what you just described, that the outliers with inherently with dice, and I think that's partially true. I think that's fair. If someone really can't handle those outliers, dice-driven games aren't for them. But I think for me, when I play a dice-driven game, I go into it knowing there might be some weird rolls in this game. I might never roll this thing that I really want to roll, and I'm
right.
okay with that. But I understand that not everyone is.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of one of those kind of preconceived notions that people have because they, played Yahtzee or whatever back in the day, and
Right.
they just, got frustrated with the roll of the dice. Like something
Yeah.
we're doing in my game is just to make sure that there is a resource that can mitigate
Mhm.
the rolling part of the dice, to where you can plan to have lots of that mitigation resource if you don't like the swing of the dice, and then use that to mitigate it one way or the other. So that could be
Right.
important.
In
Cool.
the recent expansion to Fantastic Factories, they added a
Mm,
new resource where that vitamins, I think, are the new resource, and they can just manipulate a die
right.
plus or minus one. And so, just a little thing they added, but it added a lot of variability to the game to just have that little tweak.
Right. Yeah, to kind of harness, and that's part of the appeal of the dice placement game, is to harness
Right.
the swing of the luck and be able to have agency over it. And that's just another way to do that. So
Yeah.
that's a great example. Okay, well, getting back to just kind of dice placement in general, what is your favorite dice placement game?
Well, for dice placement for the purpose of selection, um, it has changed every now and then. I think I'm going to go with. I mean, there are a few that I could pick. Like the two that I'm debating between are Marco Polo, which I really do
Mm.
enjoy, and Kingsburg, which I haven't actually played in a while. But whenever I think about Kingsburg, I get excited about it because it's a clever dice placement game. Have you played Kingsburg?
I have
Familiar with
not
it?
played Kingsburg. That's another one. I've watched the video, but I haven't had a chance to
Okay.
play it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's essentially there's a bunch of characters on the board, and you're choosing, and the numbers on the characters range from I think 1 to 18, and you're replacing between 1 and 3 dice on these characters to activate the character. And it's uh, once you place the dice there, they're blocking that character for the other players, and you're getting
Mm.
resources from those characters and things like that. And it's a really nice range of choices here, even beyond what we've talked about in terms of you have the decision of how many of your dice you are going to place. Not just where do I place a die and which die do I place, but how many. Am I going to use all 3 of my dice right now? If I rolled 3 6s, do I place them all right now on the 18 and get a really powerful benefit, or do I spread those out a bit and place the 6 on one turn and then place the a 12, the 2 of those dice on another turn?
Right.
So it's just a really streamlined but well done dice placement game.
Very
What comes
cool.
to your mind? What's one that you really are really enjoying right now?
I really like Fantastic Factories,
Mhm.
as just a interesting kind of engine builder way to place dice on a tableau of cards.
Yeah.
And I also I really like the spin that Steampunk Rally put on dice
Mm.
placement, where they integrate it into a racing game. So you're
Yeah.
kind of like building your engine, placing dice on it to move your contraption forward on the racetrack, and I think that's really cool. I
Yeah.
tried to make my game a race game at first, and it was really hard. So it turned into a game where you're earning points,
Oh,
because it's just it's hard to balance a racing game to where, because if you're a runaway leader, you're going to cross the finish line first, and it feels bad for other people. So
yeah.
it's a hard one, but it's fun in Steampunk Rally. I think they did it really well.
Yeah, I agree. But it is tough to pull that off. Yeah.
Right. So thinking about kind of any recent games that are coming out that maybe kickstarted recently or even haven't come out yet, um, are there any that are on your radar that look like might be interesting, but might be implementing dice placement in interesting ways?
Well, one that comes to mind, and this covers the dice insertion category, is I've been playing a lot of role player adventures.
Mm.
Role player itself is a different game than role player adventures, and I love role player too. But my girlfriend and I have just been fully immersed in this role player adventures campaign. The dice in the game play a role in two different ways. One, there are skill checks that you can encounter as you go through this adventure. Like you encounter a creature and you decide, I want to try to communicate with this creature that doesn't speak my language. And there's a very specific dice puzzle for that type of skill test. There's a whole book of skill tests, and you have to combo together. It's a cooperative game to place your dice and create new dice. You're pulling them from a bag. So there's even a random element of which dice that you're pulling from this bag in the first place that you have access to. And you're trying to place either specific numbers or specific colors, and often very specific numbers and colors on this skill check. And there's combat in the game as well, and combat has a very similar mechanism where you're placing dice to occupy certain spots and inserting them on to accomplish the combat. But there's so much, like if you want to look at a game with great dice mitigation, there's so much dice mitigation in this game. Like nice. That's what the entire array of cards, hundreds of cards, are based around that, around changing the colors of the dice, changing the numbers on the dice, flipping dice, tweaking, adjusting dice up and down by one, getting new dice out of the bag. It does so many cool things with dice manipulation.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the role player game, and so yeah. I like the idea of taking some of those ideas and putting it into a cooperative campaign type style game. And I've heard you talk about it in the past, and that's kind of gotten me excited to check it out as well. That looks like a cool combination there, so I'll definitely be looking at that one.
Is there one that you're excited about or that you played recently that?
So there's one that kickstarted recently called Origins First Builders. Have you played that one or seen that one?
I haven't played. I saw it on Kickstarter, but yeah.
Yeah, so I haven't played it yet either, but I watched some playthrough videos, and that one, has some interesting concepts around dice placement where the number on the dice, there's a thing that rotates on the board that tells you what kind of the best number or the threshold number you need, and that's constantly changing. So the values that you need to have on your dice are constantly changing, and then your dice increase in value as the game goes, and eventually once they hit a 6, they like retire, and you get like a bonus once they retire. And then they integrate color dice in interesting ways as well. So that's influenced actually my game design a lot when I saw what they did there, because it seemed, I like the idea of like your dice becoming more powerful if you hold on to them, because you can just flip it to the next number and kind of increase that way. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that sounds really neat.
So speaking of the future, is dice placement something that you would ever explore again in a Stonemaier game? Any plans to have dice placement used in a future game?
I'm thinking about our current games. So there is actually a game that we recently signed. It's not a game that I designed, but one that I'm helping develop. And it, I don't want to give too much away, but it does use what are essentially dice, but it is dice. So this is actually something maybe to think about, or that I've been thinking about. It uses dice as a tracking tool. So they're not meant to be rolled. And once I realized that about the game, I talked to the designer about it, and we decided to make them miniatures instead. Miniatures that we can rotate onto a certain number of sides that we need to reflect the kind of the experience of these. I'll call them characters in the game. So it was one of these things where I was like, okay, if we're not going to be rolling these dice, let's make them into another component, and that could look pretty cool, and it look even more thematic than a die might look.
Oh, cool.
So yeah.
That's a cool little teaser to what's coming up, and I can see where, like, if you're gonna have dice, you got to roll them, right? If you're not gonna roll them, make them something else. That makes perfect sense. So cool. I'll be looking forward to seeing what that evolves into when it comes out. So I guess my last question is, who do you think I should interview next in this dice placement series?
I think, I mentioned role player adventures, and you like role player. I think it's worth talking to Keith over at Thunderworks Games. he is the president of Thunderworks, and he's a really nice
Yeah.
guy. And I'm guessing that he thinks a lot about dice, given the array of dice manipulation that he put into Role Player and Role Player Adventures. So
Awesome.
I think he would be interesting to talk to.
All right, guys. Well, you heard it here. I'm going to be reaching out to you, Keith, at Thunderworks Games to see if you'd like to come on the show to chat about dice placement. Jamey Stegmaier, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today and dive deep into one mechanism of game design. Hopefully, this is useful for the folks who have listened. And thanks again, and all the best to you in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's always fun to revisit Euphoria in particular. So thanks for the time today.
No problem. All right, guys. Thank you. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and like, subscribe, and then sign up for notifications. Click the little bell so that you can be notified when we have future episodes of this dice placement series, as well as other interviews that I'll be doing on this channel with other game designers who are bringing games to Kickstarter, both new and upcoming designers, as well as well-known designers. So I hope you'll join us here in the future. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.